Welcome to Blood Axe, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, a Viking true crime story. I'm your host, and over the next 10 episodes, we'll be delving into the life and crimes of one of the most infamous figures of the Viking Age, Egil Skallagrimsson. Poet, warrior, farmer, murderer. This week, we're starting at the beginning, or as close as we can get to it. We are in Borg, Iceland, sometime in the early 10th century. A child is born into a powerful family. A family with a dark history and an even darker reputation. This child's name is Egil, and from the very start, there are signs that he is different. The sagas, our primary source for Egil's life, describe him as ugly, with a broad, black-featured face. Strong, even as a young boy. But it wasn't just his physical appearance that set him apart. It was his temperament. He was moody, volatile, prone to fits of rage that seemed to erupt from nowhere. To understand Egil, we need to understand his family. His father, Skallagrim, was a powerful chieftain, a skilled blacksmith, and a man known for his own violent temper. Skallagrim's father, Kveldulf, which literally translates to night wolf, was even more notorious. A man whispered to be a shapeshifter, a berserker who entered a trance-like fury in battle. The family legacy that Egil inherited was one of immense strength, but also of uncontrolled rage. The sagas suggest that Kveldulf and Skallagrim possessed a kind of berserker gang, a battle frenzy that granted them superhuman strength, but also robbed them of their reason. The berserker gang was more than simple anger. Men who went berserk were said to be immune to pain and to fight with the strength of wild animals. This is a family where violence is not just accepted, it's almost a tradition of sorts, and young Egil seems to have inherited the worst of it. He displays these same traits that his father and grandfather are infamous for. The saga tells us that even in childhood games, Egil was excessively competitive, aggressive, and quick to anger. When he lost, he sulked. When he won, he gloated. There was a darkness in him, a lack of empathy that was unusual, even in a society as harsh as that of the Vikings. From a modern psychological perspective, Egil's early behavior is certainly alarming. The lack of remorse, the impulsivity, the aggression, these are all red flags. Of course, we have to be careful about applying modern diagnostic categories to historical figures, but these behaviors, even allowing for cultural differences, would be cause for concern. But was Egil simply born this way? A bad seed destined for violence from the start? Or was he a product of his environment, shaped by the brutal world he was born into and the violent examples set by his father and grandfather? This is the central question we'll be grappling with in this episode: nature versus nurture. Was Egil's violent path predetermined by his genetics, by the legacy of his berserker ancestors? Or was it the result of his upbringing, the constant exposure to violence, and the lack of any real consequences for his actions? The saga paints a vivid picture of Egil's first kill. He's 7 years old, playing a ball game with other boys. A dispute arises, as they often do in children's games, but Egil's reaction is extreme. He grabs an axe and attacks. He buries the axe in another child's skull. The details of this incident are chilling. He kills a boy slightly older, and according to the saga, stronger than him, named Grim. This is not a playful shove or a childish fistfight. This is a deliberate act of lethal violence, committed by a child who should barely be old enough to understand the concept of death. The other children are terrified. Viking society was undoubtedly violent. Children were exposed to death and warfare from a young age, but even within that context, Egil's actions stand out. Killing another child in a fit of anger over a game was not normal, even for the Vikings. The other children scatter, fleeing in terror, and Egil, instead of showing remorse, boasts about his kill. "I split his skull with my axe! I killed him! I killed him!" The reaction of Egil's family to this horrific event is equally telling. His mother, Bera, praises him, saying he has the makings of a true Viking. His father's reaction is far more complex. Skallagrim arrives home that evening, And what happened next is perhaps the most disturbing incident of Egil's childhood. He hears of his son's actions, and something in him snaps. He becomes enraged. He goes into that same berserker gang, and Skallagrim, in a blind fury, turns on his own son. He intends to kill Egil, to punish him for the murder he has committed, or perhaps because he sees too much of himself in the boy now. This is a classic example of intergenerational trauma. The violence that Skallagrim experienced, the rage that he inherited, is now being visited upon his own son. It's a vicious cycle. But Egil is saved, not by his mother's pleas, but by the intervention of a family servant, a woman named Torgerd Barak. She throws herself between Skallagrim and Egil, shielding the boy from his father's wrath. Skallagrim, in his blind rage, kills Torgerd Barak. He murders his own servant to get to his own son. This act of violence, committed within the supposed safety of the family home, is a turning point. It demonstrates the sheer destructive power of the rage that runs in Egil's family. He immediately comes to his senses and is horrified by his own actions. He and Egil then throw Torgerd Barak's body into a nearby pond. Egil has escaped his father's wrath, but at a terrible cost. He has witnessed firsthand the deadly consequences of uncontrolled anger. He has seen his own father, consumed by rage, become a murderer. But did the event teach him not to kill? Or did it only show him the power that a violent man can wield? Will Egil learn from this horrifying experience? Or will he follow in the bloody footsteps of his father and grandfather? Now we move into Egil's adulthood, a period marked by even more bloodshed and the beginning of a lifelong feud that will shape his destiny. We're talking about his conflict with Berg Onund, a man who embodies the power and privilege of the Norwegian royal court, a court presided over by King Eric Bloodaxe and his formidable queen Gunhild. As a young man, Egil set sail from Iceland. During his travels, his older brother Thorolf, who is in service of King Eirik Bloodaxe in Norway, manages to arrange a good marriage for Egil. Egil marries Asgard, who was supposed to marry a man named Berg Onund. Thorolf knew that Berg Onund would be furious about this, but he did it anyway. The marriage brings with it a substantial inheritance, land, and property in Norway that rightfully now belongs to Asgard. But there's the problem. Berg Onund, the man who previously held this inheritance, refuses to give it up. Inheritance disputes were a common source of conflict in the Viking Age. Land was wealth, land was power, and the laws surrounding inheritance, while they existed, were often complex and open to interpretation. Add to that a healthy dose of personal ambition and a willingness to resort to violence, and you have a recipe for disaster. Berg Onund was not just some random landholder. He was the brother-in-law of King Eirik and Queen Gunhild. He had powerful allies and influence at court. He believed that he was untouchable, that the law did not apply to him. He was not happy about losing his inheritance, and he was furious that Thorolf had arranged for Egil to marry Asgard. Egil, accompanied by his father Skallagrim, travels to Norway to claim his wife's inheritance. They approach Berg Onund, expecting a peaceful, if perhaps tense, transfer of property. They are met with arrogance and defiance. Berg Onund essentially tells Egil to get lost. He has no intention of handing over the land. He knows he has the backing of the king and the queen. This is where the so-called Viking legal system comes into play. Egil's only recourse is to take the matter to the Gula Assembly, the regional legal assembly for Western Norway. The Gula Assembly was a gathering of freemen who met to settle disputes, make laws, and pass judgments. In theory, it was a place where justice could be found, but in practice, it was often influenced by power and politics. The king or his representatives held significant sway at these assemblies. While they weren't supposed to directly interfere in legal proceedings, their presence alone could be enough to influence the outcome. A powerful chieftain or a favorite of the king could often get away with things that a common farmer could not. Egil presents his case to the assembly, arguing that the inheritance rightfully belongs to his wife. But Berg Onund, backed by the silent but ever-present authority of King Eric and Queen Gunhild, refuses to budge. He likely knows that the assembly will not rule against him, no matter what the law says. The assembly is adjourned without a resolution, essentially a victory for Berg Onund. Egil is furious. He has been denied justice, publicly humiliated, and cheated out of his rightful inheritance. He has tried to follow the law, and he has been met with blatant corruption. It is clear he will need to take matters into his own hands if he wants to see justice. Egil decides to retaliate against Bergonund and King Eirik. First, he intercepts and seizes a large amount of tribute that was being gathered by some of Eric's men. He kills them all and takes their loot. He then goes to a feast being held by Bergonund. There, under the guise of reconciliation, Egil poisons the drinks of Bergonund's men, causing them to become violently ill. Then he kills several more of them, including Bergonund himself. Egil's actions here are a clear escalation of the conflict. He is no longer just fighting for his inheritance, he is striking back at the king and queen themselves, through their kinsmen. The poisoning is particularly significant. It's an underhanded tactic, seen as dishonorable by some, but it demonstrates Egil's cunning and his ruthlessness. The saga describes the scene in gruesome detail. Bergonund is killed, along with a number of his men, all loyal to King Eirik. The message is clear. Egil Skallagrimsson will not be intimidated, and he will not back down from a fight, even if it means taking on the king himself. This is a turning point in Egil's life. He has now openly defied the king and queen, and there is no going back. Egil's actions are a direct challenge to the authority of King Eirik. In any society, but especially in this one, of the Vikings, such defiance cannot go unpunished. Eirik's power, his legitimacy as a ruler, depends on his ability to maintain order and enforce his will. By killing Bergonund, Egil has essentially declared war on the crown. King Eirik, enraged by the death of his kinsman and the insult to his authority, declares Egil an outlaw. Egil Skallagrimsson is hereby declared an outlaw. He is banished from Norway and all its territories. Any man may kill him without penalty. He is to be hunted down and brought to justice. An outlaw is someone outside the protection of the law. They can be killed by anyone at any time without consequence. It's a death sentence, a mark of Cain that follows the outlaw wherever they go. Egil has no choice but to flee. He sails away from Norway, his life forever changed. The killing of Bergonund sets him on a course of violence and exile, a path that will lead him to become one of the most legendary figures of the Viking Age. He is now officially a Viking. But where will Egil's exile take him? What new battles and bloodshed await him? And how will the wrath of Queen Gunhild, a woman known for her cruelty and her mastery of magic, shape his future? We followed Egil from his brutal childhood to his outlaw status, earned by defying King Eirik Bloodaxe and killing his kinsman, Bergonund. But behind the throne, a darker power lurks, a woman whose hatred for Egil will become legendary, Queen Gunhild. We delve into the heart of that hatred, a venomous feud that spans years and crosses oceans. We'll examine the evidence that Gunhild was more than just a queen. She was a sorceress, a manipulator, a woman who used her power, both political and possibly magical, to destroy her enemies. And Egil Skallagrimsson was at the top of her list. Gunhild, as portrayed in the sagas, is a fascinating and terrifying figure. She is often described as beautiful, intelligent, and intensely ambitious, but she is also depicted as ruthless, vindictive, and skilled in the dark arts. Some sources even claim that she was the daughter of a Finnish king and was taught magic by Finnish sorcerers. Gunhild is a controversial figure. Some historians argue that her reputation as a sorceress is simply a later invention, a way to demonize a powerful woman. Others believe that the saga accounts reflect a genuine belief in her magical abilities, whether those abilities were real or not. What is undeniable is that she was a formidable political player, a queen who knew how to use her influence to get what she wanted. And what she wanted, more than anything, was revenge on Egil. The killing of Bergonund was not just a personal loss for her and King Eirik. It was a public humiliation, a challenge to their authority. But her hatred for Egil likely went deeper. The sagas hint at an earlier encounter, a suggestion that Egil may have insulted or even rejected Gunhild's advances when he was at court. Whatever the root of her animosity, Gunhild's response to Egil's actions was swift and brutal. She used her influence to have him declared an outlaw, a sentence that essentially made him a walking target. But she did not stop there. The saga tells us that she actively sought to have him killed, using both her political connections and, allegedly, her magical powers. She sent men after him. She put a price on his head. Magic in the Viking Age was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It wasn't just about casting spells. It encompassed a wide range of beliefs and practices. including divination, healing, and cursing. The sagas often depict women as being particularly skilled in magic, and Gunhild is a prime example. The saga describes Gunhild employing various forms of magic against Egil. She sends storms to wreck his ships. She uses spells to make him lose his way. She even, according to some interpretation, attempts to use Seidr, a form of Norse magic often associated with the manipulation of fate to bring about his death. But Egil is not without his own defenses. He is a skilled warrior, a cunning strategist, and as we'll see, he's not afraid to use magic himself. The most famous example of this is the Knighting Pole incident. After killing Bergonund and escaping from Norway, Egil finds himself on a small island. Knowing that Gunhild's wrath will follow him, he decides to take a drastic step. He erects a Knighting Pole, a powerful curse directed at his enemies. The saga describes this ritual in detail. Egil takes a hazel pole and places a horse's head on top. He then carves runes into the pole, invoking the land spirits and the gods to return against King Eirik and Queen Gunhild. He then speaks the curse aloud, his words filled with venom and defiance. Here I set up a Knighting Pole, and turned this curse against King Eirik and Queen Gunhild. I turned this curse against the land spirits of this country, so that they shall all wander lost, and none shall find his home, until they have driven King Eirik and Queen Gunhild out of Norway. The Knighting Pole was a powerful form of symbolic magic. It was a way of declaring your hatred for your enemies, of calling down misfortune upon them. The horse's head was likely a particularly potent symbol, perhaps associated with death or the underworld. The runes carved into the pole would have further amplified the curse's power. This act of magical defiance is a turning point in the feud between Egil and Gunhild. It's a declaration of war, not just on a personal level, but on a spiritual one as well. Egil is essentially saying, you may have the power of the throne, but I have the power of the old gods. And the curse seems to work, at least to some extent. Eirik and Gunhild are eventually driven from Norway, forced into exile in England. While their downfall can be attributed to various political and military factors, the saga suggests that Egil's curse played a role, that the land spirits themselves turned against the king and queen. But even in exile, Gunhild's hatred for Egil does not diminish. She continues to plot against him, to seek his death. And as fate, or perhaps the magic of the Knighting Pole would have it, Egil soon finds himself shipwrecked on the very shores of England, where Eirik and Gunhild now hold court. He's now a wanted man in the heart of enemy territory, with a vengeful sorceress queen determined to see him dead. Will Egil survive this perilous predicament? How will he escape the clutches of his enemies? And what role will his own poetic skills play in his ultimate fate? Egil's luck, it seems, has run out. Shipwrecked and vulnerable, he is quickly recognized and captured by Eirik's men. He is brought before the king and queen, the very people he cursed, the people who have every reason to want him dead. The situation is pretty dire. Egil's capture put Eirik in a difficult position. On the one hand, he had a sworn enemy in his power, a man who had killed his kinsman and defied his authority. On the other hand, Egil was a renowned poet, a man of great skill and reputation. To simply execute him, especially without a proper trial, could be seen as an act of tyranny. Adding to the complexity is the presence of Arinbjörn, a powerful chieftain and a friend of Egil. He was also a supporter of King Eirik. Arinbjörn, though loyal to the king, also values his friendship with Egil. He pleads for Egil's life, arguing that killing such a renowned poet would be a loss to their culture and a stain on Eirik's honor. He also subtly reminds the king that killing a man like Egil could make him a lot of enemies. Eirik, however, is not easily swayed. He remembers the insults, the defiance, the death of Bergonund, and Gunhild, ever at his side, whispers her counsel of vengeance. The saga portrays her as the driving force behind Eirik's desire to execute Egil. Arinbjörn, seeing that Eirik is wavering, makes a daring suggestion. He proposes that Egil be given a chance to compose a poem in Eirik's honor, a drapa, a formal praise poem of the highest order. If the poem is good enough, his life might be spared.
The drapa was a highly valued form of poetry in the Viking Age. It was a complex and demanding art form, requiring great skill in language, meter, and imagery. To compose a drapa in honor of a king was a great honor, and to have it accepted was a testament to the poet's skill. Eirik, though still seething with anger, agrees to the proposition. Perhaps is intrigued by the challenge. Perhaps he sees a way to assert his dominance over Egil, to force him to grovel for his life through poetry. Or perhaps he genuinely believes that a poem of sufficient quality could somehow balance the scales of justice. Egil is thrown into a cell, given a single night to compose the poem that will determine his fate. He is denied sleep, kept under constant watch. The saga tells us that a swallow kept flying in and out of his cell window, chirping constantly, which made it impossible for him to compose. Some believe this was a magical attempt by Queen Gunhild to sabotage Egil's efforts, that she sent a familiar to distract him. Egil's friend Arinbjörn drives the bird away, and finally Egil is left alone in the darkness, with the weight of his life resting on his ability to craft the perfect poem. Now, let's talk about the poem itself, Høyforlassen, or Head Ransom in English. It's a remarkable piece of work, a masterpiece of skaldic poetry. It's complex, intricate, filled with kennings, those metaphorical phrases so characteristic of Viking verses. For example, using the word wave horse instead of ship. Westward I sailed the sea, from the haven of the god of battle. Eagerly I traveled, in a saddle of an oar steed. Waves and storm did Odin's favor bestow on my boat when I left the haven. The poem is a tour de force. It praises Eirik's generosity, his prowess in battle, his lineage. It uses elaborate metaphors and complex sentence structures. It's a display of linguistic dexterity, a testament to Egil's mastery of the skaldic art. He even praises him for actions that Egil himself took part in on the opposite side. But could a poem, no matter how brilliant, truly save a man's life? In our modern world, it seems absurd, but in the Viking Age, poetry held a different kind of power. Poetry in Viking society was more than just entertainment. It was a way of preserving history, of shaping reputations, of conferring honor and prestige. A skilled poet was a valuable asset to any king or chieftain. To silence such a voice, to kill such a talent, would have been seen as a loss, even by your enemies. The next morning, Egil is brought before Eirik and Gunhild. He recites the Head Ransom, his poem, his voice echoing in the king's hall. The saga describes the scene vividly. Eirik listens intently, his face unreadable. Gunhild, however, is visibly displeased. She interrupts the recitation, complaining that she cannot understand the complex language of the poem. But Eirik silences her. He has heard enough. The poem, he declares, is worthy. He is impressed by Egil's skill, by his ability to craft such a masterpiece under such extreme pressure. While he will not forget Egil's past transgressions, he agrees to spare his life on one condition. Egil must leave England and never return. Egil is banished, once again an exile. He has escaped death by the skin of his teeth, his life bought with a poem. The Head Ransom stands as a testament to the power of words, the enduring value of art. But it also raises questions. Was Eirik truly moved by the poem's beauty, or was he simply looking for a politically expedient way to deal with a troublesome enemy? Did he fear the consequences of killing such a famous poet? And what about Gunhild? Her hatred for Egil remains, a simmering ember that will soon burst into flame once more. Now, the year is 937 AD. Egil, after his banishment, has found his way back to England, along with his brother Thorolf. They have joined the army of King Athelstan of Wessex, a powerful Anglo-Saxon ruler. Athelstan is facing a massive invasion, a coalition of his enemies, King Olaf Gottfridsson of Dublin, King Constantine II of Scotland, and King Owain of Strathclyde. They have united to crush Athelstan and carve up England for themselves. The two armies meet at a place called Brunanburh. The exact location is still debated by historians to this day, but the scale of the battle is not. It was a monumental clash, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the era. This is the backdrop for the most difficult moment of Egil's adult life. Brunanburh was a pivotal battle in English history. It was a defining moment for Athelstan, solidifying his rule over a unified England. But it was also a brutal, close-fought affair. The sources describe a day-long slaughter, with casualties on both sides reaching into the thousands. Egil and Torolf, along with other Norse mercenaries, are fighting in Athelstan's ranks. They are in the thick of the fighting, surrounded by the chaos and carnage of a Viking Age battle. To understand the true horror of Brunanburh, we need to examine the realities of warfare during this period. This is not a sanitized Hollywood depiction of battle. This is close quarters combat, fought with axes, swords, spears, and shields. It is a brutal, visceral struggle for survival. Archaeological evidence from battlefields of this period paints a grim picture. We find skeletons with horrific injuries, skulls crushed by axe blows, limbs severed by swords, bodies pierced by multiple spear thrusts. These were not quick, clean deaths. Many of these men would have suffered agonizing wounds before they finally succumbed. The weapons used were designed to inflict maximum damage. The Viking axe, a fearsome weapon, capable of cleaving through bone and armor. The sword, a symbol of status and a deadly weapon in skilled hands. Spears, used for thrusting and throwing, capable of piercing shields and flesh. The psychological impact of such violence is immense. Imagine the constant fear, the adrenaline, the sensory overload, the screams of the dying, the smell of blood and sweat, the sight of your comrades falling around you. These experiences would have left deep scars, even on the most hardened warriors. Egil, as we know, is no stranger to violence. He is a seasoned warrior, a veteran of countless raids and battles. But even he is affected by the sheer scale of the carnage at Brunanburh. The saga describes him fighting like a man possessed, cutting down enemies left and right. Amidst this chaos, tragedy strikes. Torolf, Egil's beloved brother, is killed in the fighting. The saga doesn't give us all the details of his death, but it is clear that it's a devastating blow to Egil. Brotherhood in the Viking Age was a powerful bond, often stronger than even the ties of marriage. Brothers fought together, raided together, shared their fortunes, and avenged each other's deaths. To lose a brother in battle, especially in such a brutal and chaotic battle as Brunanburh, would have been a deeply traumatic experience. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a key historical source for this period, describes the aftermath of Brunanburh as a scene of utter devastation. Never was there more slaughter on this island, slain with the sword's edge. The field was dark with the blood of men. Athelstan's forces are victorious. The invading army is shattered, their kings either killed or put to flight. But the victory comes at a terrible cost. Thousands lie dead on the field, including Thorolf. Egil, though he survives the battle, is deeply affected by his brother's death. He composes a poem, a lament for Thorolf, in which he expresses his grief and his rage. It goes like this. Now is my brother borne to the ground, by the sword brought low. Sore is my wound, grim is the payment I got for his life, heavy the sorrow I harbor within. The poem is a raw, emotional outpouring of grief. It's a testament to the depth of the bond between the two brothers and the devastating impact of Turel's deaths on Egil. The loss of a close comrade, particularly a family member in battle, can be a major trigger for what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The guilt, the grief, the anger, the sense of loss. These emotions can be overwhelming and they can have a lasting impact on a person's life. Egil's grief is further compounded by the fact that he wasn't able to recover Thorolf's body from the battlefield. This was a major source of shame in Viking culture, as it was believed that the dead needed to be properly buried in order to find peace in the afterlife. The Battle of Brunanburh marks a turning point in Egil's life. He has lost his brother, his closest companion. He has witnessed the horrors of war on an unprecedented scale, and though he has emerged victorious, he carries with him the scars of battle, both physical and emotional. Where will Egil go from here? How will he cope with the loss of Thorolf? And will the violence and bloodshed that have defined his life continue to follow him? Later, Egil returns to his farm at Borg in Iceland, a changed man. The years of raiding and fighting, the loss of his brother, and the constant threat of his enemies have taken their toll. He's older now, his hair is grey, and the fire that once burned so brightly within him seems to have dimmed. He has also accumulated a large amount of silver from his journeys. Returning to Iceland after years abroad was a common pattern for Vikings. Many like Egil would have accumulated wealth through raiding and trading. They would then use that wealth to establish themselves as farmers and chieftains in their homeland. Egil settles into a more peaceful life, managing his farm, raising his family. He has other children with his wife Asgerd, including a daughter named Thorgerd and a son named Thorstein. But it's his son Bodvar who is described as his favorite. The saga portrays Bodvar as a promising young man, intelligent, well-liked, and a source of great pride and joy for Egil. But the domestic tranquility is shattered. Tragedy strikes. Bodvar, while still a young man, drowns in a boating accident near Borg. The saga describes Egil's reaction in heart-wrenching detail. He retrieved Bodvar's body from the sea himself, carried him back to the family burial mound, and lays him to rest beside Skallagrim, Egil's father. This act, though seemingly simple, speaks volumes about Egil's grief. He cannot bear to let anyone else handle his son's body. The loss of a child is considered one of the most traumatic events a person can experience. It's a loss that goes against the natural order of things. Parents often feel a profound sense of guilt, even if there was nothing they could have done to prevent the death. The grief can be overwhelming and all-consuming. Egil is utterly devastated. He shuts himself in his bedchamber, refusing food and drink. He seems to want to starve himself to death to join his son in the afterlife. Egil is utterly devastated. He shuts himself in his bedchamber, refusing food and drink. He seems to want to starve himself to death to join his son in the afterlife. The saga describes him lying there day and night, lost in his grief, teetering on the brink of death. It is his daughter Thorgerd who finally breaks through his despair. She uses a clever ruse, pretending that she too intends to starve herself to death alongside him. She tricks him into drinking, which gives him the strength to express his grief in the way he knows best, through poetry. And so, from the depths of his sorrow, Egil composes Sonatorek, which translates to the loss of sons. It is considered one of the most powerful and moving poems in the entire Old Norse corpus. It goes like this. Now my course is tough. Death, close sister of Odin's foe, stands on the ness. With resolution and without remorse, I shall gladly await my own. Sonatorek is a remarkable poem. It's a raw, honest expression of grief, a father's lament for his lost son. Egil doesn't shy away from the pain. He confronts it head on, wrestling with his anger, his guilt, his sense of loss. He even blames the gods, particularly Odin, for taking his son. He questions his fate, his purpose, and the meaning of life itself. The poem is not just a lament for Bodvar, it's also a reflection of Egil's own life, on the violence he has witnessed and perpetrated, on the losses he has endured. He acknowledges the death of his other son, Gunnar, who died of an illness as well. Poetry can be a powerful tool for processing grief. It allows people to express emotions that they might otherwise struggle to articulate. Sonatorek is a testament to the power of art and how it can confront even the darkest of human experiences. But what about the circumstances around Bodvar's death? Was it truly an accident, as the saga suggests, or is there more to the story? We must remember that the sagas are not always objective historical accounts. They were written down long after the events they describe, and they often blend fact with legend. Could there have been foul play involved in Bodvar's death? Was there a rival family who might have benefited from his demise? While we can't definitely rule out foul play, there's no concrete evidence in the sagas to suggest that Bodvar's death was anything other than a tragic accident. The waters around Iceland can be treacherous, and boating accidents were not uncommon. However, in a society where feuds and rivalries were commonplace, it's always possible that a seemingly accidental death could have been engineered. Now we return to Vik in southern Norway. The political landscape has shifted. Harald Greycloak and his brothers have taken over Norway after killing Håkon the Good. They are now trying to consolidate power. Arinbjörn, Egil's friend, has thrown in his lot with Harald. Egil receives an invitation from his old friend Arinbjörn to come visit him. Egil, never one to shy away from an adventure and always loyal to his friends, accepts. He's an old man now, but his reputation precedes him. He is still Egil Skallagrimsson, the skald, the warrior, the outlaw, the poet. Arinbjörn has a problem. A man named Ljot the Pale has committed a grave offense against Arinbjörn's kinsman. The saga doesn't give us all the details of the wrongdoing, but it is clear that it was serious enough to demand vengeance in the Viking sense of the word. Vengeance was a fundamental aspect of Viking society. It wasn't just about personal retribution. It was about maintaining honor, both for yourself and for your family. To allow an insult or an injury to go unpunished was seen as a sign of weakness, and it could invite further aggression. Arinbjörn, a powerful chieftain in his own right, could have dealt with Ljot himself, but he chooses to involve Egil. Perhaps he wants to make a statement, to show that he has powerful allies. Perhaps he wants to ensure that the job is done thoroughly, without any loose ends. Or perhaps he simply wants the company of his old friend, a man who understands the language of violence better than anyone. Ljot is in the area on the orders of his king, collecting taxes. When Arinbjörn finds out about this, he hatches his plan for revenge. The plan is simple, brutal, and efficient. It's an ambush. They gather a force of men and wait for Ljot and his companions to sail into a narrow fjord. There, trapped between the steep cliffs and Arinbjörn's ships, Ljot will have nowhere to run. Honor killings in the Viking Age were often carried out in a very public and ritualistic manner. The goal was not just to kill the offender, but also to send a message to others. This is what happens when you cross us. An ambush, while perhaps less honorable in some ways, could be equally effective in achieving this goal, especially when dealing with someone who had powerful allies. The saga describes the ambush in detail. Arnbjorn and Egil, along with their men, attack lordships with ruthless efficiency. There is no parley, no negotiation, no chance for surrender. Liut and his men are caught completely off guard. They are outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The saga tells us that Liut fought bravely, but it was a hopeless fight. He and most of his men are killed in the ambush. Egil, despite his age, is at the forefront of the fighting. He kills several men, including one of Liut's close companions, a man named Halvar. The saga describes Egil cutting him down with a single blow, a testament to his enduring strength and skill as a warrior. For someone like Egil, who has lived a life defined by violence, participating in an ambush like this might have been almost routine. He's a veteran of countless battles and raids. He's seen death up close. He's caused death. At this point, killing has likely become almost second nature to him. But the killing of Liot and his men is not just a random act of violence. It's a calculated act of revenge, a message to anyone who might think of crossing Arnbjorn or his family. It's also a reminder of the brutal realities of power in the Viking Age. The saga tells us that Arnbjorn and Egil take a significant amount of loot from Liot's ships. This was, after all, a common motive for Viking raids. But the primary purpose of the attack was not material gain. It was vengeance. They then burned the ships and the bodies of the dead. In a society where there was no centralized law enforcement, where the legal system was often weak and easily manipulated, people often took justice into their own hands. Vengeance killings were a way of maintaining order, of deterring crime, and of protecting your own interests. But they also perpetuated a cycle of violence that could last for generations. After the ambush, Arnbjorn and Egil return to Arnbjorn's hall, where they are celebrated as heroes. They have upheld the honor of Arnbjorn's family. They have shown that they are not to be trifled with. But their actions have also created new enemies, and the cycle of violence continues. The killing of Liot the Pale is a stark reminder that even in his old age, Egil Skallagrimsson is a dangerous man, a man still capable of extreme violence, a man still bound by the code of vengeance that defined so much of his life. He may no longer be actively seeking out conflict, but when called upon by a friend, and when honor demands it, he does not hesitate to kill. But where will this cycle of violence lead? How many more lives will be claimed by the feud between Egil's allies and their enemies? And how will Egil, in the twilight of his years, reconcile his past actions with the legacy he leaves behind? Now, let's delve deeper into the intricacies of Viking Age family dynamics, the simmering resentments that can fester for generations, and the struggle to maintain power and influence in the face of aging and decline. We're talking about a seemingly simple land dispute, a disagreement that quickly escalates, drawing Egil back into the world of violence he thought he had left behind. The trouble begins with Egil's son, Thorstein. Thorstein, unlike his brothers, did not have a desire for the life of a Viking. He has inherited land from Egil, a valuable piece of property bordering the land of a man named Stein. Stein, for reasons that are not entirely clear in the saga, begins to encroach on Thorstein's land, moving boundary stones and claiming more and more territory as his own. Land disputes were incredibly common in the Viking Age. Land was the basis of wealth and power, and the boundaries between properties were often poorly defined. Disputes over grazing rights, access to water, and the exact location of property lines could easily escalate into full-blown feuds. Thorstein, though a capable man, is not the warrior his father is. He is described as more interested in farming and managing his estate than in fighting. He tries to resolve the dispute with Stein peacefully, through negotiation and legal means, but Stein is not interested in a fair settlement. Adding fuel to the fire is a powerful chieftain named Frithgeir. Frithgeir is Stein's supporter, and the saga hints at a long-standing rivalry between him and Egil. Perhaps Frithgeir sees an opportunity to weaken Egil's family by supporting Stein, or perhaps there is bad blood between them, dating back to Egil's earlier days in Norway. Frithgeir is the brother of Arimbjorn, Egil's close friend, but that does not stop him from opposing Egil in this situation. Family relationships in the Viking Age were complex and often fraught with tension. Loyalty to one's immediate family was paramount, but that didn't necessarily extend to more distant relatives. Old grudges, political rivalries, and competition for resources could easily pit kin against kin. Thorstein takes the matter to the local assembly, hoping for a just resolution. But Frithgeir uses his influence to sway the assembly in Stein's favor. Thorstein is denied justice, his claims dismissed. He returns home defeated and humiliated. Egil, though old and frail, is enraged when he hears of the injustice done to his son. He sees this not just as an attack on Thorstein, but as a direct challenge to his own authority and legacy. He might be past his prime, but he's not about to let anyone, not even a powerful chieftain like Frithgeir, push his family around. Egil decides to take matters into his own hands. He may be old, but Old Wolf still has teeth. He rides to Stein's farm, accompanied by several of his men. He doesn't negotiate, he doesn't threaten. He simply starts moving the boundary stones back to their original positions, reclaiming the land that rightfully belongs to his son. Stein and his men, intimidated by Egil's reputation and the sight of his armed followers, initially back down. But this is far from over. Stein was not intimidated for long. He goes and gets reinforcements from Frithgeir. Even in old age, patterns of behavior that have been established over a lifetime can be difficult to change. For Egil, violence has always been a readily available tool for resolving conflict. It's likely that even in his weakened physical state, his first instinct when confronted with a threat is still to fight back. The sagas describe a tense standoff between the two groups. Egil, though outnumbered, is not afraid. He stands his ground, ready to defend his son's land with his life. He rides straight at the group, killing one of the men with his sword. The others are shocked by the ferocity of the old man. They scatter, unwilling to fight. Egil and Thorstein then proceed to remove the boundary stones that Stein had put up, but they don't stop there. They move the stones further into Stein's land, claiming it for themselves. Ultimately, the conflict is resolved through a combination of intimidation and negotiation. Neither side wants a full-scale war. Frithgeir, realizing that Egil is not to be trifled with, backs down. A settlement is reached, one that favors Thorstein. But the resolution is uneasy. The underlying tensions remain. The saga makes it clear that this is not the end of the rivalry between Egil's family and Frithgeir. The seeds of future conflicts have been sown. The dispute with Stein and Frithgeir is a reminder that even in his old age, Egil Skallagrimsson is a force to be reckoned with. He may no longer be the fearsome warrior of his youth, but he still commands respect, still inspires fear, and is still willing to use violence to protect his family and his interests. Now, as we near the end of this saga, we're searching for Egil's silver, a hoard amassed over a lifetime of raiding and plundering. But this isn't just a story about hidden riches, it's about the lengths to which one man will go to protect his wealth, even from beyond the grave. And it's a story that, as Egil's life so often did, ends in bloodshed. Egil, in his old age, is a shadow of his former self. His eyesight is failing, his body is weak, but his mind is as sharp as ever. And he has a secret, a vast amount of silver, 2 chests full, a fortune acquired through years of Viking raids, given to him in payment by King Athelstan. Silver was the primary form of currency in the Viking Age. It was used to trade for goods, to pay fines, to secure alliances, and to demonstrate wealth and status. A hoard of silver the size that Egil is said to have possessed would have represented an enormous amount of wealth, enough to make him one of the richest men in Iceland. As Egil approaches the end of his life, he becomes increasingly preoccupied with the fate of his silver. He doesn't trust his remaining family to keep it safe. He doesn't want it to fall into the hands of someone else, so he devises a plan as cunning and ruthless as anything he did in his younger years. Egil decides to hide the silver. He has 2 slaves, and under the cover of darkness, he has them carry the 2 heavy chests to a secret location near his farm at Mosfellsbær. The saga describes the location vaguely, somewhere near a hot spring in a secluded valley. The area around Mosfellsbær is characterized by rugged terrain, with valleys, hills, hot springs, and numerous potential hiding places. It would be an ideal location to conceal a treasure, especially if you wanted to make sure it was never found. Once the chests are hidden, Egil makes a decision that solidifies his reputation for ruthlessness. He kills the two slaves, the only other people who know the location of the treasure. This act, even by the standards of the Viking Age, is shocking. It's one thing to kill an enemy in battle, another to slay unarmed slaves in cold blood. But Egil is determined that his secret will die with him. He wants nobody else to have his silver. Egil's actions here suggest a deep-seated paranoia, a fear of losing control, even in death. He spent his life accumulating this wealth, and the thought of it benefiting someone else, even his own family, is unbearable to him. The killing of the slaves is a brutal act, but it's also a logical one, from his perspective. Dead men tell no tales. With the slaves dead and the treasure hidden, Egil returns home. He never reveals the location of the silver to anyone. He takes his secret to the grave. And so begins the legend of Egil's lost treasure. For centuries, people have speculated about its location. Generations of Icelanders have searched for it, fueled by the Saga's account and the enduring allure of hidden riches. The area around Mosfellsbad has been a focal point for treasure hunters. Locals tell stories of strange lights and unexplained phenomena near the hot springs, whispers of Egil's ghost guarding his hoard of silver and other treasures. Despite numerous attempts, no one has ever found Egil's silver. It remains one of Iceland's great unsolved mysteries. Has it been found and secretly taken? Was it moved from its original location, or does it still lie hidden somewhere in the rugged landscape around Mosfellsbad, waiting to be discovered? It's certainly possible that the treasure is still out there. The landscape has changed over the centuries due to erosion, volcanic activity, and human development. A hiding place that once was obvious might now be completely obscured. And of course, there's always the possibility that Egil was deliberately misleading in his description of the location. The mystery of Egil's lost treasure adds another layer to the complex legacy of this iconic Viking figure. He was a poet, a warrior, a farmer, and a killer. And now he's also the central figure in a centuries-old treasure hunt. Egil lived to a ripe old age, well into his 80s, a remarkable feat in a time and place where life expectancy was considerably shorter. The saga tells us that he spent his last year as Muspel with his son Thorstein. He eventually goes blind. The once mighty warrior, the feared Skald, the poet, is reduced to a frail old man, depending on others for his care. Old age in the Viking Age was a difficult time, especially for those who had lived a life of action. There was no social safety net, no retirement homes. The elderly were reliant on the goodwill of their families, and their status often diminished as their physical abilities declined. One day, Egil is riding with some people to the Althing. On their way, Egil falls off his horse. He is mocked by some of the younger men for his clumsiness. Egil composes a short poem about the incident, lamenting his lost strength and his failing eyesight. This poem gives us a glimpse into Egil's state of mind in his final years. It is full of sadness and a longing for his glorious past. Shortly after this, Egil Skallagrimsson dies. It is the year 990, give or take. The saga says that Thorstein buried him in a mound near his home. But this was not the end of Egil's story, not by a long shot. About a generation later, when Christianity had become the dominant religion in Iceland, Egil's remains were moved to a new burial site near a church. His bones were dug up. And here's where things get really interesting. The saga describes the exhumation, and it focuses on one detail in particular, Egil's skull. It was remarkably large, thick, and heavy. The skull was also corrugated with ridges and bumps. The description of Egil's skull in the saga is quite striking. It's unusual enough to suggest that there might have been some underlying medical condition at play. One possibility, which has been proposed by several scholars, is Paget's disease of bone. Paget's disease is a chronic bone disorder that causes bones to grow larger and weaker than normal. It can affect any bone in the body, but it's most common in the skull, spine, pelvis, and legs. One of the symptoms of Paget's disease is an enlarged and deformed skull. Could this be the explanation for Egil's violent temperament? Could a medical condition have contributed to his rage, his impulsivity, his tendency towards aggression? It's of course important to be cautious about diagnosing historical figures with modern medical conditions. However, there is some evidence to suggest that Paget's disease can affect mood and behavior. The pressure on the brain from an enlarged skull, as well as the chronic pain that often accompanies the disease, could potentially contribute to irritability, aggression, and even cognitive impairment. The saga provides a further, rather macabre detail. After Egil's skull was exhumed, a priest struck it with an axe to test its strength. The skull did not break, but merely turned white at the point of impact. If Egil did indeed suffer from Paget's disease, it adds a new dimension to our understanding of his life and his actions. It doesn't excuse his violence, of course, but it might help to explain it, at least in part. Perhaps the berserker rage that he inherited from his father and grandfather was in fact a manifestation of a medical condition, a physical ailment that fueled his anger and aggression. But even if we accept the Paget's disease theory, it doesn't fully answer the question of who Egil was. He was more than just a collection of symptoms, more than just a product of his biology. He was also a product of his time, a man shaped by the harsh realities of the Viking Age, by the culture of violence and honor that surrounded him. He was a poet, a father, a friend, and a killer.